Paul and Haley here. They work with Dahlia's Hope, and I had the opportunity to meet them a while ago when they came in to talk about the new program. And I know Haley from a long time ago. I worked with Haley in West Valley, and I feel a little motherly. So if I like clean up Haley, it's like we've got this relationship now. But really excited to hear about them working with victims with complex trauma, specifically dissociation. So I'm going to turn the time over to them. They can introduce a little bit about Dahlia's Hope and then themselves. Great, thanks for being here.
So like Rochelle said, my name is Haley. I'm the lead clinical therapist at Dahlia's Hope, and we primarily serve survivors of sex trafficking. And I'm Bacall Hinks. I'm the clinical program director at Dahlia's Hope. And today, this is our presentation. You already have seen this, but we thought we'd throw it into a slide. We're really going to focus on what we do with disassociation for those that have experienced sex trafficking violence.
Just one second, let's kind of test the sound. How people are not hearing. Yeah, hard to hear.
Do I need to speak louder? Does that help?
Yes,
Sorry,
that does help.
Sorry, those in the room. We will project a little bit more.
Yes, you got yes with exclamation point.
Okay,
So
perfect. We will reintroduce real quick. I'm Bacall Hinks. I'm the clinical program director at Dahlia's Hope.
And I'm Haley Coleman. I'm the lead clinical therapist at Dahlia's Hope.
Oh, so sorry. Okay, so what is Dahlia's Hope? So we wanted to give just a brief introduction of what Dahlia's Hope is. We began, sorry, I just want to make sure what side I'm on. Kind of awkward to turn my neck back with this. We began and opened our doors actually in 2019 and began serving survivors in 2020, all from the tenacity and struggle and dedication from our founding survivor, Faith. I'm going to give a little bit of her story today, just a tiny bit, but we do, with her permission, obviously, have her more extensive story on our website that you're more than welcome to go read and look at. But Faith, she was actually lured by her trafficker at the age of 13, almost 14, from Mexico to New York City, and was trafficked by a rather extensively large trafficking family for about 4 years. She attempted to escape once and was caught and badly assaulted for that attempt, and was brave enough to attempt to escape again a few months later, just a few days before her 18th birthday. And when she escaped, she was able at first to get a lot of resources, right? She was a 17-year-old minor. There was all of this stuff available to her. But then she turned 18. And once she turned 18, all those amazing resources vanished. She had nothing. And so here she was. English was her third language, because her primary language was actually an Aztec dialect. Then she learned Spanish and then English, trying to navigate social services and resources in New York City after not having no support, no family, no nothing. Amazingly, she was able to do that. She's a very strong, resilient woman, and eventually found her way to Utah, where she was staying with a host family, the Stockwells, who are also our founding board members. And she, through that relationship, was just determined that she did not want other survivors to have to experience what she did. That just because you're an adult, you shouldn't have to bounce around to program to program to program, trying to find services, re-traumatizing yourself over and over and over again by telling your story to multiple people. And so she was determined to open a program, which is Dahlia's Hope, so that those survivors who were looking for resources could come to one place and access everything in that one location, so that they did not have to re-experience their trauma just to get the support they need to heal. So that's Faith. And she's quite, normally I put her picture up, I don't know why, but she's amazing. She still is on our board, and she informs what we do and provides feedback on how we're doing all the time. So basically, Dahlia's Hope, we are a wraparound program, aftercare program. And we include these following services. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we're going to talk a lot more about them throughout our program, our presentation today. But we have clinical therapy first and foremost. That is trauma informed so that we can meet the needs of the survivor. That is the only required piece of our program. So in order to receive services, you do have to participate in the clinical therapy. We also have recreational therapy, including animal assisted interventions, art, all sorts of fun stuff. That's the fun therapy. Dang it. I do the hard therapy. Case management services. We also have partnerships with, oh, you're amazing. That's so much easier for me to see. I'm somewhat blind, so I'm like, what is my slide? Thank you. Education services. So we've actually partnered with Western Governors University, where they help us with scholarships to allow our survivors in our program access what's called the PACA program, which is like a prep program for higher education, because most survivors, obviously, if they were trafficked during youth, did not have the opportunity to graduate high school or have higher education. Vocational training, as well as life skills training. And we'll go into much more detail about all of those later on. I'm talking a lot at first. Trust me, Haley will speak soon. Okay, so what is human trafficking? I believe we got a great idea of it earlier with that wonderful panel. But the definition from the Department of Homeland Security is that human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. They state that every year millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, especially here in the United States. In fact, I think I have a slide that says this, but US is one of the, if not the largest buyer of sex trafficking in the world. So we have it here very often. It's very common, actually. And this little graphic here kind of just highlights more specifically about what that looks like, because what does force, fraud, and coercion mean? So it means that there's some type of recruitment, transportation, or transfer. So that's why you'll often hear like crossing state borders. That doesn't have to happen, though, for it to be considered trafficking. Harboring, and then the means to do it. So they can use threat. It's a very similar, which I'll show another slide, to domestic violence. In those ways, they utilize substance use and addiction a lot for some of that force. And then the purpose, exploiting, including prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery. This could also be like pornography, forced pornography, not necessarily forcing somebody into an actual sexual act, but to participate in pornographic materials. So this is just some basic information and statistics about trafficking. Trafficking is the fastest growing crime globally, and they estimate, and it is an estimate because we know it's super underreported. It's estimated that 40.3 million victims of human trafficking are worldwide. But the US is the largest consumer. I did mention that. And we do know that the number of victims in 2019, according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, was they had 11,500 situations of human trafficking reported to them. In just that year, this is through their trafficking hotline, that involved over 22,000 individual survivors, for over 4,000 traffickers, and almost 2,000 suspicious businesses. This is all through the Polaris Project information. They are a great website to gather some more information and data. In fact, we have in our information a fact sheet about Utah that comes from them for you guys to look at and get more information. And in 2017, the International Labor Office reported that almost 99% of victims of sex trafficking specifically are women and girls. I would argue that is sorely underreported and misrepresented. In our program right now, we actually are serving men. And a big reason I think it's underreported is kind of the same thing with domestic violence, right? There's a lot more shame associated with being a male trafficker survivor, and it's really hard to go access help. Do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, and I think along with male survivors, that
the ones in our program at least, and as Bapal said, it's very underreported, is that they often were trafficked as children when they were younger. That's not always the case, but that's typically where we see it. And then later on, there's a lot of shame and distrust, and that's maybe not how they labeled it themselves. But that, as we see, is a very, very underreported number in other populations.
Yeah, I just went to a training and they had a whole thing about male survivorship and how we need to, if there's not enough services for female survivors, there is definitely not enough services for male survivors because most of the programs are female specific. I think we're one of the few in the country that serve males. There's actually not very, as our panelists highlighted earlier, there is not very many services for survivors, period. In Utah, for example, we are the only dedicated, so we only serve survivors of sex trafficking with our doors open. There are several trying to open their doors, thank goodness, we need them, but no shelters. So there's no safe harbor houses, no nothing. And I think, as was highlighted earlier, there is a vast importance for that because domestic violence shelters, we've had survivors who had gone to domestic violence shelters for help. And if you understand the levels of trafficking organizations, there's usually, they call them the bottom girl. There's usually a girl who's actually helping to organize the trafficking. And often they'll send the bottom girl into the domestic violence shelter to get their trafficking victim out and back in. So just a different dynamic is occurring within trafficking versus domestic violence. They are a commodity. They are making money for the person. And so there's a little bit more, what's the word?
There's more to lose, unfortunately.
There we go.
We'll talk more about that dynamic. And as many of you know, as advocates, what you see with domestic violence and that relationship between power and control, there's an added layer of they are also an economic and financial commodity to them. So that is a huge loss when they are escaping. It's not even just that loss of power, but it's also that loss of financial gain too.
Thank you. You said that way better. Okay, just some other statistics. Again, these are all from the Polaris Project. They have much more statistics on their website. I just pulled some that I felt were really important for us to understand what statistically we're looking at when we think of sex trafficking survivors. These are the 3 top identified sex trafficking types. So where are the traffickers putting or advertising the victims in order to be trafficked? And it's, you know, through escort services, massage, health, and beauty parlors. So getting your hair done. So not just massage parlors, also like basic salons, and then pornography. I thought this was important, and I put this in here as well because I think we have this media idea of what trafficking looks like is somebody like our survivor, founding survivor Faith, you know, was brought from another country and was trafficked and then was able to escape and is now a survivor. When the reality is it's in our communities, it's in our neighborhoods. Most recruitment tactics come through intimate partnerships. So they call them Romeos. So they become in an intimate relationship first before then trafficking the victim. Familial is the next. So that is trafficking through family. And when I think through our survivors we're serving now, the vast majority fall within those 2 situations. Even our founding survivor who came from Mexico, she came because her boyfriend at the time promised her a better life. So it was still an intimate partner situation. Then it's through job offers, advertisements, posing as a benefactor. When I met with youth homeless center, what's it called? My brain today. Sorry, I've had a long week. They said that happens often. Thank you. They said that happens often that kind people will show up to homeless youth encampments and say, hey, I can help you get food. I can help you do this. And then they kind of feel like they now owe that person something.
There's a question online in the chat that
goes along with that. It says, what about those TikTok accounts that promote becoming escorts or dancers?
So that would be like job offer advertisement components. Mhm. So kind of saying, and that happens a lot. That's how you get into pornography, right? Like, oh, you can have this great job, and then it turns into more of a forced and coercive action. False promises, fraud falls into that as well.
We actually do have a survivor in our program right now who falls under the category of trafficking, but as well as labor trafficking. She was promised like a job, and she was coming to be a nanny, and then it just escalated from there, and she was forced into a marriage, and it just proceeded from there. So it can happen on all different fronts, just like that.
The nanny family did?
Yeah, the
Or
man,
trafficking.
The
it
spouse.
was a spouse. He wanted a nanny for his children, and he forced her to marry him. Yeah, so it fell under labor and sex trafficking in that situation.
And this is what I was referencing about being very similar to domestic violence. They actually pulled the power and control wheel and kind of highlighted how things are similar or different in each of those levels compared to domestic violence. And then just highlighting that there is no single method of force, fraud, and coercion. So just trusting the survivor's story is really important when you're talking with them, when they come into your program. I think I heard somebody say that either like, don't classify them, don't say this is your story, or tell them they have been trafficked, because sometimes that can be scary for them and then they don't come back for services. So just being very aware of this power and control. And this relates, as Haley said, back to why we do what we do in our program and the way we do it, because there is such a unique dynamic of power control that we have to make sure that we're meeting their needs in a different way. Okay. Finally, Haley.
My turn to talk. So who are survivors? They look different, as has been said in the panel earlier. There are a lot of media stereotypical interpretations of survivors. So of the estimated 40.3 million survivors of trafficking, 4.8 million of those are survivors of or victims of sexual exploitation, and they disproportionately affect women and girls. But I will also want to add in here as well other gender identities, specifically those within like the LGBTQ plus population, and we can go into more about the reasons for that. But many don't label themselves as trafficking survivors. So I have some survivors that I'm working with who said they didn't really realize what happened to them was trafficking until like within the last year. That wasn't a label that they had for themselves. They weren't walking around thinking like I've been trafficked. That's not always the case. But for some of the survivors, it happened when they were kids. They didn't know the dynamics of what was going on with their family members and that they were being bought or sold, behind closed doors. Like they weren't aware that that was going on, but it actually meets the criteria for trafficking. So that's something that I think is important for service providers when you guys are talking to people that you're working with and you're coming in contact with, that it can be anyone. They're everywhere. And that's part of the next point I wanted to highlight, is that you're coming in contact with them all the time. So in advocacy work, in hospitals, schools, courts, police departments, mental health treatment, crisis treatment, substance use, they're in all of those different locations. And so you're coming in contact with them, whether they're telling you, hey, I'm a survivor of trafficking or not. So some of the traits that put someone at high risk for becoming trafficked, what we're seeing and a lot of the statistics are reflecting, is that it's not just the issue of trafficking, it's the issue that they have experienced years of complex trauma, meaning stressful environmental factors that are happening over several years, whether they were children, in adulthood, adolescence, and it's recurring over and over. And those risk factors, as we highlight here, are some of the vulnerabilities that make them vulnerable to trafficking. So trafficking is typically like it's on the end of the spectrum, but there's a lot that happened before that. So having an unstable living situation, homelessness, we've talked a lot about that already. Having a history of domestic violence, that power and control, again, that intimate partner relationship is a huge factor. Having a caregiver or a family member who's a substance user, or having a substance use issue, runaways involved in the juvenile justice or foster care system, undocumented immigrants, are facing poverty or economic need. Again, that's like another vulnerability factor. And then having a history of sexual abuse or having an addiction to drugs or alcohol. And we'll talk more about that relationship between substance abuse and human trafficking and sex trafficking specifically. We've got a couple of graphs under here for demographics, but again, it's all very underreported and we don't have an accurate idea of who is actually being trafficked. And it can be anyone. It's honestly anyone.
Yeah, and I'll just add two things. One, one of our most oldest survivors, primary survivors that we serve, that actually was her story. She ended up going to like a conference talking about trafficking, just happened to go to it as part of her schooling. She was in school at the time and was like, oh my gosh, this is what happened to me. So until she was like in an area where somebody was talking about statistics and things that happen with trafficking, she had no idea that was even her situation, even though she had gone through it for over a year. And that when you come in contact with survivors, also a couple of our survivors who presented recently at our gala, we had some survivor voices speak, and they both were older females in their 30s, parents. Their day-to-day life presented normal, but they were being trafficked. So it really is anyone and everyone. There's not like a stereotype to look out for.
So we've got a couple of slides on dissociation. So this is what we're talking about. Dissociation in sex trafficking survivors, what that looks like. So we have some of the DSM criteria. So that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is not to say like we want you diagnosing anything. That should obviously be done in a clinical setting, but this is so that you can see what are dissociative disorders, what do they look like, and how do they present with victims and survivors that you come in contact with, and that hopefully that can inform your care for when you are working with them. So the first one is, and I want to highlight first before going into them, is that individuals can experience dissociative symptoms without meeting the criteria for a dissociative disorder. And all of us as humans, we all experience some level of dissociation. That's when we're driving, we're zoning out, we don't remember getting somewhere, we're like forgetful, or we're zoning out. Maybe you're doing it right now. Maybe you're zoning out right now.
No.
Hopefully not. So there's some level of that that's normal, but then we're going to go into what is, I don't like the word normal, but not normal, so to speak, as it's an increased level. So the first one we have here is probably the one you guys have heard of the most. So this is dissociative identity disorder, DID, which is formerly known as multiple personality disorder. So this is something that's been very sensationalized in.
Right, we have.
That's been sensationalized in the media for what this looks like. And the goal and the purpose that I hope we can do today is sharing that this is what quote unquote like normal people may be presenting with. They may have dissociative disorders, and it's not this obvious like shift of a totally different person. It can be, but it doesn't always look that way. So DID is characterized by two or more distinct personality states, and the disruption in identity involves a discontinuity in a sense of self or their agency. And this is very, very heavy on the language, so it's okay. You don't need to know all of the specifics. I just feel like it's helpful to go over. But it's changing and alteration in their affect, their behavior, their consciousness, their memory, their perception, cognition, or sensory motor functioning, things happening with their body. So there's also recurrent gaps in recalling everyday events or important personal information, like they may not remember things about themselves, but it can also be traumatic events, like big things that they don't have a memory of. And it can also include difficulty in recalling everyday events. And it's inconsistent with ordinary forgetfulness. So it's not just your usual, like I forgot this, or I'm having like a moment where I lost my train of thought. It's a little bit different than that. And another key distinction is that this is causing significant distress or impairment in their functioning, like whether it's affecting their work or their relationships or whatever it might be. And this is not a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or spiritual practice, because there are some forms of that that can look a little bit different for each individual person. And then the symptoms are not due to the physiological effects of like drugs or alcohol. So it's not blackouts because of a substance or a medication or some other medical condition. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in some of the coming slides. The next one we've got is dissociative amnesia. So people have heard of amnesia before. That's more of that forgetfulness of like a memory or event. In rare cases, it could be for years. So this is that difficulty to recall information. It can be about yourself, your name, where you live, your address, or it can be specific to traumatic events. And again, it causes significant distress, and it's not due to other medical conditions or mental health disorders. Do you have any?
No, there was just a question. I said, we are going to answer it shortly.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna do a midpoint pause for questions and then keep going. Okay. So then the next two we've got is depersonalization and derealization disorder. You may have heard of these before. So this is the presence or the persistence of recurring depersonalization and derealization. So what that looks like is depersonalization is when we are disconnected from our body. So sometimes people say like I was seeing myself, or like a bird's eye view, or it wasn't connected to myself. They're not present in their body. And this can also be disconnected from time, your emotions, your physical numbing in your body, your thoughts. And then derealization, on the other hand, is a detachment from your surroundings. So that's that disconnection from your space. Things might look foggy or disconnected or distorted, and feeling like they're not present in their body in the room that they're sitting in. And again, this is causing clinically significant distress. It's not because of drugs or alcohol or another medical condition. And then lastly, we've got other specified dissociative disorder, so OSDD. You might hear that in discussions in trafficking community. And this is just, they might be experiencing dissociation, but they don't meet the full criteria for some of these other disorders, but they have significant impairment with dissociation.
And just a note, depersonalization and derealization can also be symptoms of DID. So they can either be separate diagnoses, or you can see kind of that happen within this full dissociative identity disorder. Okay, so we kind of, Haley referenced this. Dissociation is, I'm going to sneak a poem around the object so I can read the slide. I'm so sorry. It is part of being normal. Like, we all do it. And so I kind of want to talk about that spectrum of disassociation so we can kind of highlight what, like, we don't want to jump to conclusions, basically. Just because somebody may have experience of some dissociation does not immediately equate to diagnosing with one of these disorders. So it is a common practice in life. It is actually part of our autonomic nervous system. So our fight and flight response, that's where disassociation occurs. Somebody asked a question about, does it happen even if somebody experienced trauma in childhood? Actually, disassociation is more common and almost always occurs in connection with childhood trauma. It's more likely to occur at that age than not having any abuse and then experiencing a trauma later in life. You're less likely to see disassociated properties with that kind of abuse than if you experience as a child. It's very connected to childhood trauma. Great question. Honestly, I think it has to do with the way the fight or flight system is, and going back to that power and control piece. Children are probably the most powerless individuals in our life, in our world. Their entire life is dependent on adults to care for them. And so when they're put in traumatic situations, that idea, and I'll speak more to this a little bit, but when you disassociate, it's that battle between your fight or flight response, your sympathetic nervous system activating, and your parasympathetic system activating, because the fight or flight gets us up and going, right? We're going to run, we're going to fight. But when you feel powerless or when you can't fight, then your body needs to activate the parasympathetic so that everything slows down and you can freeze, you can stop. And so in that moment is where we see the disassociation, you kind of check away from the experience happening. Does that make sense?
Fascinating.
It is fascinating. We nerd out on this stuff all the time. Sorry,
We're not
we're
rebooting
not
right
gonna
now.
reboot yet. So yeah, more common response for children, specifically children who experience sexual violence. Freezing is, I already said that. So one of the things we're highlighting, and Haley's going to speak a little bit to this as well, is there's different lenses that the mental health community views disassociation through. And one of the lenses is actually related to developmental trauma. So going back to this childhood trauma, it's actually normal for children and adults to have different mental states, right? Like I am not the same person standing in front of you right now, presenting with my personality as a presenter, as I am at home with my kids, right? That's a different part of me. And then another part of me is a different way with my husband or my mom or dad, right? We have these different mental states that we employ in different environments, which is completely developmentally normal. We all do it, yes. But what we see is that when there is a lot of trauma and there's a lot of abuse and neglect that occurs specifically developmentally in childhood, that these splits occur. So they refers to the aspect of the self felt to be so unacceptable and threatening. So there's a part of them that feels threatening and they're shamed by it. And probably the part that experiences the abuse, yes, that they disavow and wall off that part from personal awareness to the point that the person behaves and reflects with no effort to account for the disparate behavior in different circumstances. So they have developed such a split, disassociated part that they're not even aware when that part is activated or engaging in society with others. And then he was going to speak to the other part.
Yeah, so like the Paul said, the mental health community sees dissociation and DID in different lenses. So there are some clinical modalities that see that as, oh yeah, it's a totally separate personality. And that's kind of what we see in the media, right? Like they're like another person, they have a different personality. But I want to speak to, there are other modalities that see this as the multiplicity of the mind, meaning we all have different parts of ourselves, right? The part of us at work is a little bit different than the part of us at home, or when we're really angry, we've got an angry part of us. Like there's a normalized part of that. So there's a clinical modality called internal family systems therapy, or IFS, that sees this as a very normal structure of all humans, is that we all have different protective parts, but with people who are experiencing DID or dissociation, they just might have more extreme protective parts, which makes sense if we think about the level of trauma. If there was a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse, a lot of neglect, a lot of violence, that they would need different protective parts and coping skills to deal with that. And that's part of what dissociation is. And so I hope that you look at this through a lens of curiosity, that we're not looking at it as this is weird, this is, a different personality state, but these people look like everyone else. Really, honestly, we can talk more about what this looks like. Like I have clients who meet the criteria for DID and they hold full-time jobs and they work. And then some that are not able to work who have DID because of the impact of where they're at in their trauma healing. So just to normalize that there's a spectrum like we're talking about of small levels of dissociation, and then it can go a little bit more extreme, and that's where we get full-on DID, where there's amnesia barriers, or meaning there's not a memory of the different parts that are taking over.
Yeah, and she brought up protector parts. Like when we see survivors who are struggling with substance use, or a very common characteristic of a lot of survivors is this like helper part that wants to go out and advocate and help other survivors, which is a way that they kind of have protected themselves from the trauma. I think that's important, that some of these dysregulating, difficult behaviors that we see when we are working with victims and survivors of even domestic violence, and not just trafficking, but some of those difficult behaviors are really their protective parts, trying to keep them going. That makes sense. See, we said we'd have midpoint questions.
Okay, well, we have one in the chat, and it says hypothetical, could a client develop DID because of being trafficked? Or what is seeming to be that? Could they say that their alter consented, but the host did not?
I mean, that would make sense when you think about the way parts work, right?
Yeah, and this, we would kind of have to go down a clinical rabbit hole, so to speak. So there's certain parts that can have like amnesia barriers, or there's not a memory. So to that question, yes, that could happen where maybe a part was consenting or engaging in activity. But that if we look at it that way, if an individual has so many different parts, or they're having difficulty with memory or post-traumatic stress, that they're not actually in a place to consent entirely as their whole self, right? Maybe a part of them did, but that does not mean that their entire being, when they are in a more clear headspace, consented to something happening. And so that's something where I work with some survivors who they did kind of take on a persona. We're seeing this a lot with trafficking. It has a name and a personality, and that's the persona that she had to take on to do the work that she had to do in her trafficking. And she was aware of it, so there wasn't that, complete blackout of memory, but she still felt like she had to be a different person to do that kind of work.
I would also add there is a component of our fight or flight response that is not talked about as much as the fight, fight, or freeze, which is called fawning. And it is a protective measure, like when we are activated and we know we're in danger, that in order to stay safe, we comply. We do what is asked for us. This would be like somebody who like rushes home to clean the house before the spouse comes home so that they prevent from having the abuse happen. It looks like they're complying. They might even say they like doing it, or that it's something they want to do because they are protecting themselves from harm. So that is also maybe a component of what could be occurring there as well.
And to highlight that that is an actual nervous system response, not a choice. Like it's an actual response that I have to submit, I have to do, I have to engage in this in order to maintain safety. And I'm sure you guys see that in sexual assault, domestic violence, all of those situations.
Safety is always number one priority for all humans, right? So a lot of our behaviors come out of that feeling of not feeling safe.
Chat. Anyone in the room?
All right, awesome. I don't know.
Okay, so this is what does dissociation look like in clients? So we've talked about it, but now what does it actually look like when you're sitting down with somebody and you're talking to them or you're providing services to them? So some of the common simple forms of this are like staring off, asking for questions to be repeated a lot. Like you can tell someone's not present if you're talking to somebody and their head is elsewhere. Glazed look in their eye, unresponsive to questions or comments that you're making to them, might not hear you. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might not be dissociation. They might just be distracted, but their body's in a trauma response after a really stressful event. It can also look like shifts in posture and body movements. So when someone has we're looking at the case of DID, a very distinctive part that might come in. Some of the clients I work with, I can tell their posture changes and they might slump over or their eyes look differently. So some of those body movements might not be as common that you see, but it's possible. And there can be a drastic change in appearance, handwriting, dress, or speech when we're talking about a very distinct personality part in the instance of DID. Sometimes it might look like, whoa, you're like a different person coming into my office from when I last saw you. Part of that can be normal. We're all humans. We all can dress, talk, change style differently. But if you're seeing patterns and trends in that could be attributed to some level of dissociation. Noticeable change in an inner dialogue or hearing voices, like having that kind of dialogue for themselves internally. Again, some part of that's normal. Like some people just talk to themselves when they're at home alone or in the car, but also having the confusion of having a lot of different parts or voices can be a symptom. Complaints of memory loss or gaps in time, or having a difficulty putting timelines together. Again, I'm sure you see a lot of that with domestic violence and sexual assault. and working with them in timelines, right? It's our trauma brain, it's a stress response. We don't remember things logically in order as they happened. And then difficulty remembering personal information like age, address, location. It could be driving somewhere without the memory of getting there at all, like completely, like I don't even remember getting here, they just got here. It's that autopilot. Feeling detached from their body or surroundings, saying like seeing themselves from a bird's eye view, watching themselves doing something where their surroundings look foggy or distorted. And then of note that some symptoms of dissociation might not be obvious at all. You could have people you're coming in contact with who are experiencing this and present completely normal to you when you're working with them.
Yeah, like often re-asking for services or information is really common. We get that, I would say, probably the most. And we'll talk more about how we deal with that when we look at our different component parts. But I would say that's a really, like if it's consistent, again, if all of this is over time, right? Like if this happens once, you're not gonna be like, oh, disassociation. But if you're seeing it regularly every time you work with this, with a client, it would be something to be curious about, for sure.
So these are some of the clinical modalities and treatments that we do with dissociation. So you can see the list here. Some of them might be really familiar to you, some of them might be different. So EMDR is a very typical traumatic stress, PTSD, trauma therapy. Dialectical behavioral therapy, which is DBT, internal family systems therapy, which I mentioned earlier. Accelerated resolution therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing therapy. These are a lot about the body. This is about how the body feels, because again, with dissociation, it's not being present in our body when something is happening because it's so stressful and overwhelming. So thinking about any kind of violence, sexual violence, that's why we're seeing a lot of dissociation. It is overwhelming for the nervous system. Sand tray therapy, art therapies, group therapy that are typically like skills focused, so DBT and CBT, and recreational therapy. But I will add that most of the survivors that we work with immediately exiting trafficking, they're not like, I'm ready to do trauma processing. That's not where they're at. And they might not even be there for years and years and years. So like EMDR, that is not something that we typically do with someone who meets these dissociative disorders, because that's not safe. They're not actually able to be present to reprocess things. We're working on safety, stability, coping skills. How can we help them feel safe in their body? We're starting at that, and it's a long process, and we're seeing that pretty consistently, that a lot of the things we're doing are regulation, and probably a lot of things you guys do in crisis intervention as well. It's not, let's go and process the trafficking that just happened that you got out of. That's not what we're looking at. That might be years down the road.
Yes.
Sorry, I know we have questions now.
Yeah.
Is the goal of therapy to be able to adequately handle what is? Will you repeat the question?
So the question was, is the purpose of therapy in order to handle for the client to be able to handle or address when different personalities come out? No. So that's
Or is the goal to get rid of that?
no. No to both.
Okay.
I'll start and then I know what you're going to say, so I'll let you finish. So really, and Haley was kind of really talking this up a lot. Really, the first step in any therapeutic intervention is actually assessing and developing a felt safety. So there's a difference from being safe and feeling safe. And even though they might actually be safe, their body is still in that response, right? And so a lot of those somatic and more like body, like recreational therapy and sensory somatic psychotherapy, those kinds of things, they are more about creating and calming down the autonomic nervous system so that they're feeling safe again. Then we can introduce some of these other modalities where we're working on reprocessing the trauma itself. Now about the parts, I'm sure Haley's got something to say about that.
So that's a great question. I love that you asked that question. So the goal of therapy isn't to get rid of parts. It depends on the therapy modality, like any of these listed. There's different approaches to it. The approach that typically I've seen that's most helpful with parts is anytime we're trying to get rid of or shame or blame, these are their protectors. When you're telling them to go away, that's really frustrating and infuriating, and it actually creates more backlash. So the goal is to understand, to learn more about, understand the intention of, and start to work with the parts so that they can create safety through trauma processing. Maybe it's stuff in their environment, it's resources, so that those parts don't feel like they need to be so extreme and protective, so that their authentic self can lead in their life instead of these protective parts. When we look at the brain, it makes sense why they're there. If you hear someone's story, you're like, you actually understand what someone has been through. It makes so much sense why they would have such extreme protective parts to get them through their life and to survive. So that's a great question. And the goal of therapy is more to understand and to integrate.
I'm going back to a slide just so to highlight something as well. So according to the developmental trauma lens on dissociation, the biggest reason there is splitting is because there is a part, right, that is so unacceptable and threatening that it is disavowed. And so the more you actually shame and try to get rid of it, just following in line with Haley's point, the more it will stay and grow and be stronger. So that's, you would never say, we're going to get rid of your parts. It's more, we're going to integrate you into a whole human again.
That doesn't sound right. I don't know enough to actually answer that.
Yeah, your intuition was right on that though. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Okay, so we're going to transition into what we do and how we address or work with disassociation with our clients at all the different levels of our programming. So you guys kind of get a really good idea of what it looks like. So we kind of told you what it is. Now we're going to show you kind of a little bit of what this looks like.
So clinically, this is what we do at Dahlia's Hope. So first off, individual and group therapy. That's the individual therapy is the only requirement for them to participate in our program. So this is, like we've talked about, a slow process to stabilize and maintain safety. For some clients, we're not even talking about what happened to them for months and months and months. We're actually just working on how they can feel safe and to feel connected. And this is a part that I think as victim advocates and service providers, how they feel with you, that is the number one thing that you can do. If they can feel safe with you, that's the best thing that you could possibly do. That's one takeaway. So meeting the survivor where they're at in therapy. So Maslow's hierarchy in this triangle here. We're not going to start working on how do we process trauma if they don't even have a place to live or if they don't have food. And in crisis care, that's the work that you're doing. How do we create more stability for them to even get out of these situations into safety? So we start with where they're at and slowly build up from there. A lot of psychoeducation about the brain and the body, what's going on for them, what's happening when they're like, I don't even remember getting here today, like what's going on, helping them understand it so it doesn't feel as scary. Healthy coping skills, emotion regulation skills, things that they can use on a day-to-day basis. Then we can introduce like therapy interventions we just talked about. Looking at peer connections and support systems, that's huge. And not just within a program, if they have other people in their life that they feel safe with or comfortable with, that I had a survivor this week who's had some of the most huge gaps or huge strides in progress that I've ever seen. And it's simply because she found a friend group that she feels safe with. And that was a huge factor. She's had a significant decrease in a lot of symptoms. So that safety and connection, whether that's with the program or just in their personal life, is huge. And then boundaries in our program and their personal life. That's one of the biggest issues with trafficking and with domestic violence or personal violence, is there's such a violation of boundaries, and that can play out in so many ways. We'll talk more about that in a few slides. Consistency is huge. Trauma is just chaos. It's unpredictable. So having consistency is one of the biggest things that you can do. And then assessing the readiness for trauma processing. So we're not doing any harm. We're not trying to re-traumatize by like saying, let's just dive into your story and start doing this work. And then actual trauma processing. That's like one of the last steps that we're getting to. So incorporating trauma processing modalities, some of the ones that we talked about, like to utilize dissociation assessments. So there are different assessments to assess, like, do they actually have meet the criteria for DID or dissociative amnesia. There are some questionnaires and tools that clinicians use to diagnose. And then in our program, we also have weekly team meetings for all the staff to collaborate on what's happening with the survivors. What are we seeing at rec therapy? What are we seeing in group therapy? What are we seeing? So we have a continuity of care. And then we also have a clinically supported transitional house. So this is not a safe house like we're talking about. It's not a safe house. It's not for crisis. This is for survivors who have done a lot of work in their healing process. They are stable. They have jobs. You just need a little bit of support to get on their feet. That's part of something that we do clinically in the program.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I didn't add this earlier, you reminded me. Like our program is not set up nor designed to treat those survivors who are just exiting trafficking or needing a safe house. Our transitional house is not like secured the way domestic violence shelters are. It is a house. I mean, it has some security, obviously, but it is a house. It's meant to just be a house so that they are transitioning into independence. And so again, there is nowhere in Utah that has that level of treatment at this time. Sadly. We need to get on it, people. All of us together, right? Okay, recreational therapy. So we're weirdly, I've been reaching out to some other aftercare programs for survivors of sex trafficking, and we're really one of the only programs I've met with that has recreational therapy as an integral part of their program, especially with this being on an outpatient basis. But I felt that it was very valuable and very important to include it based off of all the information we know about dissociation and how it really is related to the body. And it starts, healing starts with that calming down of that system. And so obviously the body is integral to trauma healing. Everyone read Body Keeps the Score? Yes, and it's like the core book everyone reads if we're in this field, right? He states, and Bessel states in his book, that we need to have a relationship with the body in order to self-regulate. Without that relationship, we're left to using the external environment to regulate our emotions. And so without understanding and knowing our limits or our capacities, we're left to like what other people are doing or saying to understand how we should feel, which is really interesting, right? So that really is our goal. The book also talks about attachment theory in and of itself, and attunement talks about this as well, that rhythmic positive social interactions are key to development of attunement and attachment, which is what we need. That's how we develop trust with others, right? If I don't have a healthy attachment pattern, I can attune to other people. I'm not going to trust you because I don't have that capacity. So this is what we do at Dahlia's Hope. We utilize in our recreational therapy program these life skills and satisfaction surveys at intake. So we know where they're at and if they are increasing in these life skills. We have weekly life skills groups. We have weekly trauma-informed yoga. So we're trying to get the body moving in a safe, healthy way. We have weekly self-defense classes, which many survivors love and never miss. Of course, we have additional group activities, including animal-assisted therapy, equine therapy, and then our rec therapist is amazing and is actually assesses each individual survivor for their specific needs and does individual movement type activities with them as well. She goes hiking a lot with them, which is really cool because that bilateral movement is very helpful in processing trauma as well. I think we're both saying this one. Case management. We talked a lot about this. We're referenced a lot of this, that the trauma and that has been experienced by survivors, as well as this idea of power control, actually makes this probably our most difficult position in our agency, because they're having to come to somebody to ask for help. And then that means they are powerless to that person, or they feel that they are powerless to that person. And so it is really important for us to build that trust. So just kind of going back to boundaries, boundary setting is so important for the staff, as well as helping the survivor understand their boundaries. Many financial concerns, anytime money is brought up, that is definitely a trigger. So just as you guys are working with survivors, understand that they were kind of money was controlled for them, right? And so that is just such a trauma response that you will often see dissociation, as well as language use. We were just talking about this yesterday. There's no way you could know what type of language is going to be a trigger for a survivor. We have had survivors have extreme reactions to language that seems completely normal to us, and not every survivor has that same reaction to that same language. And so it's not about just being careful about your language. Of course you need to be, but it's also about when talking with survivors, recognizing what a trauma response could look like so that you can repair, right? Because the one we were talking about yesterday was, we used the word assume. And a survivor in our program said that that's what always happened to me. It was assumed that I would do everything for my trafficker. So when somebody assumes something about me, it's really triggering for them. And so who would have thought, right? So it's not necessarily about not using the language, it's about recognizing when it is an issue and making that repair. And then obviously ensure clients have choice and self-determination so that we're not holding that power over them.
And I think this is probably the most applicable slide for the work that you guys do as service providers, because you do case management and crisis intervention, and maybe you do other work as well, but highlighting to recognize the role that you play in having power. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but having the resources. If you're connected to law enforcement, that's another level of power. If you're with an attorney's office or prosecution, that's another level of power. And so recognizing the power dynamic when they're coming to you, that could be really, really difficult and triggering for them when you're working with them. And I don't know, we could open it up for questions, but have you guys experienced that? Sometimes extreme reactions from clients that you're working with, whether it was language you used or they thought you promised a resource and it didn't come through and you got a blow up about it? Yes,
All the time.
I'm seeing a lot of heads.
You are not alone.
Yes. So that's kind of the key part. We're going to talk about ways to like mitigate that. And this is one of the biggest things that we're seeing. It's a reenactment of their trauma. You're holding something, or they feel as though you're withholding a resource from them, which is what happened in their trafficking. And so it can be very, very, very triggering. And when I say triggering, that can just look like level 100 anger at you, right? That might just be how it presents.
And that could also be just a symptom of disassociation. Sometimes that's their angry part, that they know if I bring out my angry part, I usually get things because I'm fighting for it, right? And so it really is also a part of that disassociation to be aware of.
Okay, so this is at an administrative level and other staff, the ways that Dahlia's Hope tries to look at understanding trauma-informed care and dissociation. And this can be for other people at the agencies that you work with that maybe don't do direct work, but these are just people that they may come in contact with. So in our program, we have board of directors, we have a development team, a clinical team, volunteers, and community partners. We have weekly and monthly updates on programming so that we can all communicate and be on the same page. And then we utilize our staff meetings to educate other people on what does trauma-informed care look like, symptoms of dissociation, what does it look like if they're forgetting appointments or asking like rescheduling things, or if they're non-responsive to you. That was said in the panel, like they just don't show up sometimes to things, and that could be for a lot of reasons, but that could be due to part of their mental health and dissociation, right? That their headspace isn't clear for that day and they're not present in their self. So helping other people within the agencies that you work with understand what does this look like to create more patience, more curiosity, more kindness and compassion when working with them. And then clear and appropriate boundaries between all clients and staff. We could not stress that enough. We've run into a lot of conflicts and issues, not with anything that's crazy and appropriate boundaries, but just little things that might happen that really create a loss of trust. If they feel like they were promised something, or just personal interactions. And so we've had discussions among our team, just people in the office, who's answering the phone, who's talking to them, who sees them in the hallway, who sees them in the elevator, what are appropriate questions to ask them, like making sure that you're still being professional across all of the staff that they come in contact with them, so that you can keep really good professional boundaries, because it's really easy to blur the lines of personal relationships or friendships, because you might really, really care about them and form a really close relationship with them, but it still needs to be professional. And then just awareness of memory loss and gaps, like canceling appointments that might be attributed to some level of dissociation or their mental health, that they're not purposely trying to, maybe they are, but maybe not, but they're not trying to miss out on things or participate in the process, which I know can be really frustrating, especially within the court system, if like they need a survivor to show up so that they can put their trafficker away. That this can be a really big factor.
And Haley's mentioned a couple of times, like feeling like something was promised to them that we're not following through on. And the simple language implies that. And so just being just going back to using appropriate language, like simple things like we sent out a message, we may have, does anyone have any need for Thanksgiving, right? And a lot of the survivors were like, yes, this. And then we had a few that were like, thought that meant it was a guaranteed, I'm getting this for Thanksgiving. And that when it didn't come through, it felt like we were not to be trusted, right? We had made a promise. So the intention behind the language, right, was, hey, we're just looking, but we weren't clear enough. So that's what I kind of mean by like ensuring your language is very clear, concise. Like, I will see if there is a resource that can meet this, but there is not a guarantee. I would always be sure to make sure they understand I can't guarantee this. Because that it's almost always implied that it is a guarantee. If we say we're going to do it, we should do it.
So this is more just highlighting what we talked about, trauma-informed care in the workplace, how you guys have probably learned a lot about this. You're already doing these things. Some of it's not new, but just that extra level with people who've experienced complex trauma, which is typically survivors of trafficking. It's not just the trafficking, it's years and years of abuse, neglect, violence before that. So boundaries, this is setting clear, appropriate boundaries about what your expectations are of them in your work together, and then what they can expect from you. That's such a great way to start off a conversation, so they're not assuming, or we're not assuming, that they're going to do something or that we're going to do something. Remaining consistent with them. Trauma is chaotic and it's inconsistent, so keeping consistent communication. If you're say you're going to call, please call them. If you say you're going to show up for a court date, show up for that court date. Just the consistency helps build the trust, which you guys already know that, but just highlighting it. And then looking at this. Oh, discussing limits, again, based off what the call said, discussing limits in what your agency can do, letting them know like, hey, that's not something that we do, we can look for a resource to somebody else, so that they're not, again, thinking, oh, you said you were going to help me and then you didn't help me, and then there's that barrier of trust that's lost. So training on red flag behaviors or dissociation, and maybe we shouldn't have called it red flags, but just flags for when they might be dissociating. So letting other people in your agency know, like, oh, she looks like she's really not present, or he doesn't look like he's remembering our conversation, like having that communication that other people can pick up on some of those cues for dissociation and what it looks like. And then always asking permission before doing something. This is just good practice in a work setting in general and in life, I would argue. But this can look like really simple things, but like touching someone, like saying, excuse me, and touching their elbow to like get past them, narrating what you're doing. Like, hey, I give an example of when my clients come into my office and saying, I typically close the door for confidentiality for my clients. Is that something that you're comfortable with? What do you prefer? Giving them a choice, giving them that ability to choose what happens, and narrating what you're doing. I think that's a really good way of remembering trauma-informed care, because they're constantly feeling like everything is a threat. When our nervous system is stressed, we're looking at someone's tone of voice, the door being closed, the setting, the environment, everything feels unsafe. So narrating what you're doing and explaining intentions is really helpful to create more safety in what you're doing.
And I think the value in this is that every person is unique and what will bother them or not bother them, or what they're comfortable with or not comfortable with. So instead of saying blanket, here's how you should present in your office, it really should be more about what is comfortable for the person that you're working with, because it may not be the same for this person as that person. Haley highlighted touching the elbow, but then we actually have a survivor that unintentionally, we had a staff member tap her to let her know that there was somebody trying to get her attention. And it was a movement that had happened to her in a abuse situation that she had been in, and she actually disassociated like that fast. Such a small little thing, but she wasn't aware it was coming. She didn't know, and it took her off guard. And so just a simple narration, verbally saying, hey, there's somebody, you know, getting her attention first before touching or doing anything is really important to do.
And again, some of these things are not preventable. You're not going to know. They might just happen, but it's about the repair afterwards, having a conversation afterwards about it, about your intentions, you know, repairing the relationship. And then again, highlighting the narrating things and the self-determination, giving them a choice as much as possible to their preference, what they would like to see happen. Again, that's really hard in legal cases or in law enforcement, where they might not have the same choice. They just have to go along with the process if they're willing. But in any interaction you have in the work that you do, if you can give them a choice and a preference or asking them, that's so helpful to create safety, and it's more trauma informed, because especially with sex trafficking survivors, the loss of power is huge. They did not have any control over their money, what they ate, where they stayed. There were so many things taken away. So giving a choice back to them is a really, really big part of creating more safety and trust, especially with service providers and advocates. That's a really big component.
Our board member always says, finding the yes. Always try to find the yes for them. So it may not be, I can't do this, because oftentimes we use that verbiage, right? Like, we can't get you this resource. That feels very much like they have this loss of power and you're controlling what they have access to or not, right? That might be true, but what can you do? And so always presenting things in the form of a yes, so that it empowers instead of takes away that control. Does that make sense? Okay, concrete techniques for you guys to use if somebody is dissociating, or just having a trauma response in general. If these would be effective for both. And if we have time, we might do one or two of these to kind of just practice them with you guys. But we kept talking a lot about how the disassociation response and the trauma response is a physical body feeling. It's not something that's controlled. It is our autonomic nervous system that just happens. And sometimes it's occurring before we even realize it, right? Like, we've all experienced that. And it's even out of our control. I've spoken at 9 billion things throughout my career, sad I'm told. And it doesn't matter how many times I talk, I have an autonomic response to having to stand up in front of people, right? Even though I know I'm safe, you guys are cool, nobody's gonna hurt me, but my body is just actively engaged regardless. Yes, it's the same for the survivors. They are not consciously saying, oh, this is threatening. It just happens. It is a physical response. So that means we need to utilize physical techniques to help to ground and regulate that response. And one of the things that influences our autonomic nervous system more than anything else is our senses, our 5 senses specifically. The first one is the 5 senses. Has everyone done this one, the 5 things? It's like the best technique. And this might be one we will practice with you guys later. So unless you want to do it now. We can do it later. Okay. But really it is helping them to utilize their senses for safe things. So when we're looking for 5 things in the room, we're bringing them back to the present, right? Like, what are 5 things you see right now? So it's not something that's in their brain. They're not rethinking of the trauma. They're looking at, like, I see the picture on the wall. I see the drapes on the window. I see this door, right? And they're looking at things that are safe right now in this moment. And you just kind of go through the different senses for that. Now, smell is an interesting sense, because when you do the research, smell is actually the only sense that bypasses, now I can't remember the part of the brain, I think it's the thalamus, goes straight to your amygdala, goes straight to your emotion part of the brain, which is why it's such a strong sense for memory. Like if you smell something positive, I like to use the words like cookies baking, and you're like, ooh, those smell good. How many times are you triggered by like a positive memory? Like, I remember this one time where I had the best cookie, or I was baking cookies with my mom when I was little, right? And that's because the smell sense is just goes straight to that amygdala, that emotion part of your brain, which is really unique. On the flip side, it's also the fastest thing to trigger you. In college, I was taking a trauma class, and my professor was talking about a couple he was working with who had been assaulted in their home right after a pizza delivery guy had come and delivered pizza. And so the smell of pizza was extremely triggering for that female in that situation. It took him a long time to figure out why, because that part of the story was always left out. But whenever that person would smell pizza, she would go into a trauma response, right? Has anyone ever gotten sick from eating something and then you smell it later and you're like, oh, I'm so nauseous, and you don't know why? That's why. The sense of smell is so powerful. And so you can utilize this to help with grounding. You just have to be careful, because you want to maybe have some like options available. Or even if it's somebody you work with often, pre-select a smell that you know is a calming smell for them, so that you can have it even in your office while they're there. And I know there's some offices that are like no smell offices. So it can be like small, like oils that are just intimate that they can put in their hands and smell, or a candle that you can just open and let them smell. It doesn't have to be like dispersed throughout your office, but just make sure it's a choice. You're not just having it running for them regardless. Like, get permission, kind of going back to the last thing. But so that's another really good technique that you can use to bring somebody back into that present moment, to bring them back into their body.
Do
Yeah.
any of you guys use some of these techniques, like responding out in person? Do any of you guys do that, or responding out on scene, or you're working directly with them? What do you guys do? Do you do some of these things? Do you do different things? How do you help them when they're just like, they're freaking out, they're in a trauma response, they're angry, they're crying, they're not present? Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to repeat that. So the first thing you said was sensory fidget toys, which, yay, awesome. We have those too. And then the second thing you said is when you're doing your safety planning, you're not just assessing for physical safety, you are also assessing for emotional safety and helping identify what are triggers and whatnot, which is actually really good. Sometimes survivors will know their triggers. Sometimes they won't, and we'll learn them together. They'll be like, surprise, that was a trigger. Let's figure out what to do with that now. And both are okay, right? So great points. Anyone else?
In the chat, they say they utilize the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method for anxious moments, feeling fear, and use it on the crisis line as well.
Awesome.
And then another one says, I brought little bottles of essential oils to a hospital when assisting with CODARs, especially peppermint to help with nausea.
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I saw, there's another hand.
Just like also remembering like the basic needs. A lot of people bring tea, a lot of people still carrying that snack, offering water. Just those basic needs. Sometimes there's such a heightened emotion and such a heightened response that they don't even realize. That they need those things.
We have snacks in all our offices. So yes. Yeah, absolutely. She said having food, water, things that are assessing for those like biological needs as well, which we have coffee, tea, multiple snacks.
You don't know when they're laughing at what.
Oh, yeah.
I think too, like
making it really simple for them, if you overwhelm them, too many options or something like that. I was just thinking, I had a really very good happen in the last 2 months when my house was hit by a tornado. It was weird. Like the tornado ran from the entire city and it demolished my fence and it shattered my window and there's glass all over my room. It's like kind of scary. So, oh gosh. So I was just kind of in that. Because what do I do? Can't really think, you can't really process. Everybody's coming in. They're like, what do I do now? Can I do this? Can I do this? And you're like, I don't know. Like your brain stops functioning. Well, it is functioning. But it's a different part.
Your prefrontal cortex stops
Yeah.
functioning.
That
Yes.
part, yeah. And so someone came over very kind and it was like, can I get you dinner? Or would you like to do dinner? I can't. This is why I can't decide where I want to go for dinner on a normal day. Let alone when I'm in the moment. And so finally she's like, I can go to cafeteria. Do you like burritos? I'm like, I like burritos, And so I think just making whatever you have there simple and available. Like, here, would you like to do something? Just offering lots of decisions, like your decision making for the brain. Online.
Yeah.
So I will synopsize that. So she had a very traumatic experience. And there was a great story. I wish I could retell the whole thing, but basically she was saying, make whatever we offer in that moment simple, because your critical thinking, your ability to make choices is kind of offline when you are in crisis. And 100%, we know that when your autonomic nervous system, I work with a lot of kids and adolescents as well. We call it flipping your lid. This is your autonomic nervous system part of your brain. This is your prefrontal cortex. And when it is activated, your lid is flipped. There is no capacity for rational thought. There is no capacity for decision-making. And these grounding techniques are going to calm this system down enough that then our lid go back over, protect, and go back online. So that's really the purpose of doing these things. Absolutely.
Yeah, so exactly what one of you guys mentioned is sensory toys, fidget toys. That is huge. I have a whole bowl in my office of different things like Play-Doh or even pipe cleaners. Like people can wind them on their hands. You can get them at the dollar store. Rubik's cubes. There's a million different things. They even have specific fidget toys you can buy on Amazon, a whole bag of them that you can put in your office. And then encouraging them to use something that they feel comfortable with. I always find that inviting, if you're working with them consistently, inviting them to use it each time helps them feel comfortable to do it. Because sometimes I just have it sitting there, but if you don't tell them what this is, why do you have all these toys sitting on your desk, or letting them know hey, while we're talking, if you just want to have one of those in your hand, if you're comfortable, you're welcome to grab them. You don't have to ask my permission. That makes it easier for them to just do it on their own, because often I find people don't intuitively grab something and play with it on their own. So inviting them to do that and giving them permission. And then these are some more of our sensory awareness exercises and grounding. So we talked all about the senses. This is one of the quickest ways to help you be more present. So deep breathing. I'm sure you guys have used breathing with them, right? That's one of the quickest ways that we can slow down our heart rate. There's a ton of different ones. Box breathing, if you've heard of that, that's just even amount of breaths. If you're thinking about the size of the box, inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, just having something consistent. Or ladder breaths, that's when we're doing, we're inhaling for 1 second and exhaling for 1 second. Then we go up to 2 and then 3, you're kind of going like a ladder all the way up. A body scan, this is where we're connecting with the body, noticing what sensations we're feeling. And we might do this with you guys afterwards, just to check in with your body and being present. How do you feel sitting for hours on your chair, going through each part of your body? Exercise, again, that's one of the quickest ways to get present. You get endorphins pumping through your body and your brain. You get the movement going. So a lot of those are really, really helpful. Being outside. Sometimes I even use with clients, having them using things that are, I think it's on here, temperature. I'll have them run their hands under cold water, or if you have access to ice, I know that's kind of hard if you're on the go, or even having them stand up. If they're really struggling and not present, having them stand up and like stomping their feet to like feel themselves standing on the ground. Again, with the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, labeling, describing, touching things, helping them get back to a centered place. And then I just want to add that sometimes grounding skills in a clinical setting and therapy can feel unsafe actually for them. So that there is a caveat to that. And typically in a crisis situation, it can be really helpful. And Bacall, you can talk more about this, but sometimes grounding or getting in touch to their body, like their body was unsafe their whole life, and that might actually be really hard for them to connect with. And you can explain more about that.
Yeah, so it really comes, if you remember, I was talking about dissociation comes from this idea of like the autonomic nervous system, how the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are working together. And the sympathetic is really, the parasympathetic really is to calm our bodies down. Yes. So the action is to lower the heart rate, to bring all those systems offline. So we're not ready to run and fight. We're ready to just calm and just be there. Right. And so if we are using those techniques to create that sensation in their body, that is the sensation that they actually experienced during their trauma. And so it could have the potential of triggering a trauma response more than less. And so rather than the calming exercises, if you know this is typical for a client you work with, you would just focus on the grounding, the ones that are like, you are here, you're not there, you're in this moment, you're actually safe right now. So those kinds of exercises versus the deep breathing exercises that are going to calm that system down might not be as helpful.
And I'd say that's not the majority of the time. That's just no. Typically all of these things, breathing, grounding, especially in an immediate crisis, are really, really helpful and effective.
But if it doesn't work, you know why, and try something else, basically. Any questions about that? All right, do you want to do an exercise with me before we do questions, or should we do questions first? What do you guys want to do?
I do have a question. It came up in the chat earlier. They want to know, like, how is a person accepted to this program? How do you referrals?
Perfect. We actually we did send to you guys the brochure that we have. A couple ways you can get in contact with us. We're going to share our contact information is in the slides right there. As well as we have our Dahlia's Hope information phone. Just of note, don't call that 885 number right now. It's broken. We broke it. We are fixing it. So call us, the Bacall, Hinks, and Haley Tolman number for right now, or best would be to go to info@dahliashope.org. You can submit a request for information, and then we can call you or the survivor who needs our services. And then obviously there's a lot of information on our website as well. And just to clarify, those crisis survivors, you can still refer them to us. We wouldn't be able to provide services. We would be then actively looking for programs that would, which at this time is mostly out of the state. So just kind of know that's where the situation is for those safe houses and more residential type programs for survivors. Or we help them get to DV shelters, or we help them get to substance use programs if they're struggling with addiction.
And I will say that it is hard because we're outpatient, so we're more of like on the tail end of things after they've exited trafficking and they're in a somewhat stable place. It's not a specific timeline that we're saying like you have to be out of trafficking for this long, because we're seeing with every survivor it's so different. Some of them are having a really hard time and they've been out of trafficking for years and years. Some of them have found more stability and they've left trafficking like 5 months ago. It's just so different. And so you're always welcome to refer clients to us, and we can assess where they're at with things, because they might be a good fit for gaining that independence and working on their own healing. And even if it's not now, just if they know about us in the future, that if they ever feel like they're at a place where they want to work on some things clinically and get a community with trafficking survivors, that they can know that we're an option.
We actually do a screener for everyone that calls us, so that we are checking those boxes and we know exactly those barriers to accessing our treatment, what they are, and we assess for them right up front, and then we can refer out if they aren't going to work for our program, and or schedule an intake if they are. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. Haley was going to do a calming grounding exercise with us today, just so you guys get to experience a little bit of what we do.
Yeah. Does anyone have a preference for like doing a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for a body scan? No? Okay, well then let's do the body scan. So even those who are listening, if you guys want to take a second and get comfortable where you're sitting in this space here, get comfortable. And if you feel comfortable or safe, you can close your eyes. If not, you can just focus on the ground or something in front of you, find a neutral space. If you don't want to do it, that's okay. You don't have to do it. So with the body scan, you're just going to start with your toes and your feet and just notice how they feel in your shoes. Maybe you don't have shoes on. You wiggle them around. Notice how they feel connected. If there's any pain or discomfort. And take a deep breath, a nice inhale in. And then exhale. And work your way up to your legs, your calves. Move them around. Flex the muscles of your calves. Notice any tension or tightness that you might feel. Working up from there, notice the upper part of your legs and your thighs. How it feels to sit in your chair. Again, you can tighten your muscles, relax them. See if you have any pain or discomfort, and just notice it. Moving up to your lower abdomen, your stomach, and your core. Check in if you're hungry, maybe you're starving. Full, you feel tightness. Work your way up to your chest and your shoulders. See if you have any tightness or if you've taken a deep breath in a while. I invite you, if you haven't, to take a deep breath right now. You can roll your shoulders back. Notice if you've been keeping tension in your back, how you've been sitting in your chair. Noticing any pain or discomfort. And move up to your neck. You can roll your neck from side to side. Roll it in a circle. See if you feel any tightness in the back of your neck, side of your neck. It's been doing an important job of keeping your head on straight. You can make any movement that feels comfortable. And work your way up to your face and your head. Notice if you've been holding any tension between your eyebrows or if you've been clenching your jaw. Open your mouth and unhinge your jaw, stretch your mouth out. Even contort your face, squeeze the muscles in your face and then relax it if that feels comfortable. And then lastly, noticing your arms and your hands, how they felt when holding things, if your fingers feel tired or stressed, if there's any tightness, make any movements in motion, roll your wrists out, whatever feels comfortable. And then lastly, take one last deep breath in. And then an exhale. Whenever you feel ready, you can open your eyes or refocus back into the moment and the space that you're in. So that's just an example of a body scan to get in touch with what's actually happening in your body. And you can use that with your clients pretty easily.
Awesome, thank you. Last chance for questions. If not, that's our presentation.
That's good. Well, I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much. I always love it when I learn new things. When you talk about recognizing your power dynamic, that was something I hadn't ever really thought about before. So learned a lot of great knowledge. So
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
we did raise hands.
Sorry.
No,
I'm
no, you're
kind
good.
of curious about your guys' transitional housing program. Is that run by like your staff or is it peer run?
A little of both. Mostly a little of both. So there is not a staff on site. Again, because they are independent, that is the purpose, right? So the people who in our program that would qualify for the housing would be somebody who is maybe further along in their treatment, has some level of stability, is not going to be in crisis most days. No, they won't have crises, and that's where the clinical support comes into play. But really they're working, they are maintaining their life, they're just not ready for that full independence yet. And so it really is transitional, right? Like you're basically independent, you're on your path of healing, and you just need a little bit extra support before you are completely on your
This, perhaps you answer this. Is this only for 18 and older?
own. No, we work with adolescents, absolutely. It is outpatient, so that makes it easy, right? We don't have to worry about like housing. The transitional house is kind of a component of it. All the services are outpatient, so absolutely. My background is with children and adolescents, and so especially if they are in a safe family environment, whether that's foster care, kinship care, or even their primary home, which is very rare usually when a child has been trafficked, but we have youth in our program right now. Actually, she turned 18. Our youth is no longer a youth. But yes, we serve members. Great question. Yes.
So what are your careers on like things like food? And she's still in the state. And still trouble with structure.
Sure.
Like I
Perfect.
candidate that far out.
Oh, absolutely. We have no like criteria of like, it has to be within a certain amount of time period. Absolutely not. In fact, a lot of survivors, like we kind of mentioned, they don't even recognize that that is what their experience was until they've run into somebody who can label it for them. And then they're like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And so, I mean, we have a few of our clients that are far removed from their trafficking experience, but still right now, yeah, where does this survivor person live? Arizona and Idaho?
No.
Okay. But if they are far away, we actually have national partners that we can connect with and say, what's in this state for survivors? And we can get people those resources. They're great. In fact, Safe House Project is a national organization that helps people, survivors, find programs across the country, as well as the National Sheltered Alliance. Both of those are great resources if it's not somebody in Utah or they need a higher level of care. Those are people we partner with to find that higher level of care. So you guys are welcome to use those resources as well.
I just want to add one more note. I know everyone wants to be lunched out. I'm so sorry. That
only because you made us aware of it.
sorry, made you aware of your stomachs.
No
that-
judgment.
That we didn't really talk a lot about this, but the correlation with substance use and trafficking, and that is part of our program, that we're not going to turn away services if they do have an active addiction. It might just be that they need to either go to a detox center and then receive treatment from us, or we've actually sometimes partnered with like Utah Harm Reduction if they're able to like safely use and maintain stability to be in therapy. We can do that. So we don't have a hard and fast rule of sobriety, but we do have to have some level of safety and care, because doing therapy and trauma work is really difficult, and having an active substance use issue is going to complicate that, and we run into that problem. So just highlighting that there's a really big correlation between substance use and trafficking, as I'm sure you guys see. So that is really common.
In fact, substances are often used to like, as part of that forced fraud and coercion component. And so it is really common to have co-occurring. And we benefit too, like Utah has a ton of substance use programs, probably the most of any state in our country. So, you know, if they are willing and able to get into like a 30, 60, 90-day substance use program and get that stability, they could also, we could be working with enrolling them in our program at the same time. I think that's
We'll
it.
leave now.
Honestly, you technically have 9 more minutes, so.
I know, but you scheduled this right before lunch.
But fascinating topic. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
We will break for lunch. Please be back at 1.
So thank you, guys.